Hey everybody, Coach Toolshed here, and in today's video, going to be bringing you my review for The Last of Us Part 2. And as with all reviews here on Coach Toolshed Gaming, you can rest assured that I've actually taken the time to beat the game entirely before posting this review. I know it's a crazy concept, but that's the sort of service that you get here at Coach Toolshed Gaming. But before we get into the review properly, I just want to let you know that the purpose of this particular review is to actually review a video game. Now, I know that that might be a crazy idea when it comes to The Last of Us Part 2, but that is what this review is going to be attempting to do. I'm going to be trying to give you an unbiased and unvarnished review of the game. So if that's what you're in for, if that's what you want, then stick around. If that's not what you're here for, if you just want to get mad before I even say anything, and you're down in the comments already, stop. I know you're down in the comments already. That's not what this review is. So just go ahead and listen. Thank you. Now, one of the first things you can point out about this game, and it's really not very controversial, is that it looks phenomenal, especially when you consider all the interior detail that is put into each separate building that you go into, the environments out in the world, the level of polish that goes into the cutscenes. Everything about the graphics of this game is top-notch, aside from the fact that it doesn't run at 60 FPS or higher. Unfortunately, it is still stuck down at the PS4 first-party exclusive standard of 30 FPS, which for the most part the game does hit. I only noticed a couple of times where I got a little bit of frame rate hitching here and there. Nothing major, though. It only happened once or twice throughout the entire game, but the game certainly looks phenomenal, although we're going to get into some of the environmental issues that I had a little bit later on. But it is hard to dispute that everything in this game, if you just sit there and are looking at a still photo in the photo mode of this game, or you take a screenshot, it's going to look great because they did a fantastic job with that. There's really no denying it. And Naughty Dog is always at the top of their game. Now, I will say, I don't think that The Last of Us Part 2 is that huge leap forward that you usually see during a generation from a Naughty Dog game. I think some of the other games we've seen before have really pushed the envelope. This one, I feel, while it's still at the top, I think you're still looking at something that's kind of on par a lot of times with God of War and even Horizon Zero Dawn in some certain situations, especially with the environment. Those other games are also fantastic looking games. Naughty Dog here, though, is not slouching in the graphics department at all. I also want to briefly discuss the audio because I did have a couple of audio bugs. For the most part, everything sounds really good. Especially the weaponry all sounds really strong. The audio cues, the directional inputs, all that, you can hear everything that's going on, and stuff that sounds far away, it sounds where it's supposed to. I didn't really have any issue with that. The only issues I did have, a couple of audio bugs where once in a while gunshots would sometimes drop out, and sometimes melee hits I would get no sound coming out, but that was few and far between. For the most part, this game ran pretty well. No crashes, anything like that. I can't complain from it. For a polish standpoint, the game is actually pretty good. Now let's get into the gameplay, and this is where I'm going to start having some issues. And this isn't just in regards to straight up how the game feels in your hands, because overall, if you liked the way the game felt in the last game, I think there's some improvements here to that formula. The shooting feels a lot better. Running around feels pretty similar, but the fact that you can dive and sort of go into a crouch position right from a run does make the game feel a little bit more fluid. But those sort of kind of stiff controls and the running back and forth where your character kind of feels like they got 50 pounds of bricks in their pants, that is still there. So if you didn't like that from the last game, the characters still feel very similar when they're moving around. The climbing still feels the same and all that, but they are a little bit more nimble than you were in the previous game. Like I said, the gunplay is actually much improved, especially when you're aiming down scopes. I actually think that they did a fantastic job with the scoped weapons in this game. They all feel very good when you're aiming down sights. They feel powerful. Everything about it feels good. I did have one other minor issue when swapping out weapons. I had a couple of bugs here and there when swapping out weapons with the in-game UI, with the weapons wheel that they have provided in the game. Sometimes the weapons just weren't swapping out. I'm not sure why. It happened at some bad times and it happened at some calm times. So it was, once again, something that only occurred a few times, but it was kind of an annoyance anytime I'm trying to quickly switch to a weapon during, say, a boss fight, and I won't swap out for some reason because the UI just was not responding in the in-game wheel. That was kind of annoying, but overall they did a really good job with the way the weapons handles I think that they did a much better job when you're moving on the fly. It feels more action-packed at times when you're trying to run and gun a little bit, whereas in the last game it was a lot stiffer. So they really did make some improvements there. It probably is Naughty Dog's best work when it comes to how weapons feel. However, when it comes to the melee combat, the melee combat is kind of a mess, and unfortunately, much like it was in Uncharted 4, you have to engage in melee combat through certain parts of the game, and you're going to have to learn how to dodge and counterattack. Unfortunately, unlike the Last of Us game, you can't just go in and get a hit whenever it looks like you can run in and get a hit. You have to dodge and stun an enemy before you can really start getting hits in. It's really kind of obnoxious, and the fact that there's so many of these scenarios throughout the game where you're going to be stuck in melee combat, or an enemy will grab you and you have to just jam on the square button to try to survive, it happens all of the time. It's really obnoxious. Every melee encounter turns into basically some sort of QTE, whereas in the last game, yes, sometimes they had that, but Joel could also go through in the last game and just start hitting people, hitting enemies, hitting the infected, whatever. He could go and do melee combat with most, not all of the infected were susceptible to it, but he didn't have to go and wait for these QTEs to happen all the time with every single hit. Sometimes you have to do this multiple times for each enemy. You have to dodge and then counterattack, and dodge and counterattack, and dodge and counterattack, and then they go down. And the problem is when you start getting groups of enemies that start hitting you off screen, when you dodge, you start moving off of screen away from the enemies, and then you can't see them. You got to start swiveling the camera around. It's just kind of an annoyance. And later on in the game, they incorporate this with some of the boss fights that the game has. This game does have a few areas where I would consider them to be boss fights, and you do have to use this melee combat. You won't have weapons necessarily available to you. I don't think the melee combat is good. I think this is a big step backwards from the last game. So, gunplay better, melee combat, not so much. So, there's also a few other things that we have to talk about when it comes to the gameplay, and especially some of the scripted moments that the game has. One of the problems and one of the things that have been criticized about Naughty Dog games for many years is that they're over-reliant on certain methods to get you through their game. Now, some of these sequences can be fun, but when they keep happening again and again, and the same type of set pieces keep happening, it loses all the effect. So again, similar to stuff that happened in Uncharted 4, there's too many of these sequences and it takes the drama out. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the scripted run for your life moments where all you're doing is basically sprinting forward as fast as possible. There's too many moments like that in this game. It's an antiquated method of storytelling. People have been complaining about it in Naughty Dog games for a long time, but there's a lot of it in this game. Again, another classic Naughty Dog trope with they seem to have a problem of transitioning from one zone to the next, so they just have you smash through a bunch of floors. And in this game, right off the bat, they have you start smashing through floors, and then you're smashing through floors. And before you realize it, you're halfway through the game, and you've probably smashed through a dozen floors already just to transition from one area to the next. Now, does it make somewhat sense? Yeah, you're going through dilapidated buildings and whatnot, but it's tired when it happens all the time. And it's something they've been criticized roundly for in the past, that it's just kind of like, why do you guys keep doing this? It's too much, it's overkill, and in this game, it's really no different. There's a lot of transitions like that. Another one of the issues that I have with the setting, not really the gameplay so much, but it does affect how the game feels. The setting that you're in, for 90% of the game, you're in one location. You're in one big city, and I'm sure any of you who've seen any of the preview stuff, you know that the main city that you're in is Seattle. You're in Seattle for most of the game. I would say at least 80 to 90% of the game. And that's fine. And they did a good job building a really big city. It's very dense. There's a lot of exploration you can do. However, there's no backtracking involved at all. Once you go through an area, you're probably never ever going to go back there. But the issue is that because so much of the game takes place in one spot, there's really not a lot of variety in the environment at all. And because it's such a wide open area, it takes away all of that suspense and the danger that lurked in so many of the areas from the previous game, where every area felt like it was handmade and handcrafted just for specific encounters, and you remember those encounters. In this game, I don't remember hardly any of the areas I explored in Seattle. There's a couple of buildings that had some unique stuff in them, but not necessarily any combat engagements, not necessarily any major story beats. It just seems like a lot of exploration for exploration's sake, finding crafting material, clearing out buildings where there's just like, okay, here's a few things that I found. It's not really progressing the story. It's not really all that interesting because, like I said, you take away that suspense. In the last game, everything was linear and everything felt more constricted, and you had to go through these really tight zones. In this game, in the second game, you're going through much wider zones, so you can kind of skirt around a lot of the danger. And if you get into a fight, you have plenty of room to react because the enemies are so far away. Even if they see you coming, you have so much time to react. It's not claustrophobic. It's not suspenseful like the last game was for so much of the game. Now, later on, it does get a little bit better in that regard, and you get into more tighter situations, especially against some of the infected. But by and large, aside from a few really cheap clicker jump scares that they had when you're trying to sneak through maybe a crack in a wall or trying to crawl underneath something and a zombie will grab you real quick, or sorry, an infected will grab you real quick. There's a lot of clicker jump scares. But aside from that, all of the suspense and that sort of dread that you felt in the last game when you dropped into a new area, I wasn't getting it in this game because it just felt like, okay, here's another area, here's another room I'm going to go through, grab some supplies and go. Maybe there'll be a few enemies to clear out, but then I can go. I never felt like I had to sneak past anything really. I felt like I could always take out whatever I needed just by blasting away, whereas in the last game I felt like I needed to conserve my ammo and my supplies. In this game, I freely was attacking enemies, and I never even felt like I was low on anything. I always had plenty to deal with, aside from one boss late in the game, which was like a super boss, which I was not expecting it to be as powerful as it was. That was a very strong boss. New enemy type. But aside from that, very disappointing set pieces and areas in the game because so much it was just forgettable areas. I just finished this game yesterday, about 12 hours ago, and I already am foggy about so many of the spots where I went to, whereas in the first game everything is burned in my mind. And not just because I played it so many times at this point, but the first time I played it, you remember the Lake House chapter, you remember Pittsburgh and the sewers and Billstown and going through Boston and all that. It's just, there's nothing here aside from one spot near the end of the game that really burned into my head. And that spot at the end of the game was so different than everything else you see in the game that of course it stands out. The problem with this game, with the environments, is lack of variety. And it's because of the way they paced out the story, and they shifted away from that seasonal aspect, and everything takes place for the most part in the story outside of flashbacks. It mostly takes place within a 3-day time span in Seattle, and this leads to just a complete lack of real variety, and it's kind of disappointing. I also feel like they neutered one of the most lethal enemies in the last game, which is the clickers. In The Last of Us Part 1, clickers were really a terrifying enemy that could overpower you very quickly. In this game, they're actually weaker and easier to take out than your basic infected. You can just sit there and wait for them to walk up to you and just stab them in the head with Ellie's knife. They're no challenge really whatsoever. It's kind of like similar to what Bethesda did when they neutered the lethality of the Death Claws for Fallout 4 compared to what Death Claws used to be, where they used to just rip you to shreds, and now in Fallout 4 you could just casually take them aside. It's kind of a joke. It's kind of disappointing. Now, they did add a couple of new enemy types to the game, and that's fine, but the fact that the clickers are just actually some of the weakest enemies in the game now, just kind of an odd decision, because Ellie's melee attack or stealth attack is just so overpowered against clickers. It's weird. It actually is easier for her to kill a clicker than an infected runner. You have to do more work to kill the runner. You have to, first off, avoid the fact that it can see you, then you have to grab it, and then you have to do the attack. With the clicker, you literally just sit there and do one button input. It's a one-hit kill. It's a little bit nuts. I'm not sure why they did it. It takes all of the suspense out of when you hear the clickers. After the first area, I realized, oh, these things are no threat at all anymore. It was kind of disappointing. One of the other things I should point out, too, for a franchise and for a company that is renowned for its animations and its character motion capture and all that, the jumping animation in this game is laughably bad. It makes Bethesda look like they know what they're doing with jumping animation. I just wanted to throw that in real quick because it looks absolutely asinine. But anyway, moving on. A couple other things struck me real quick before we move on to some of the more story-based elements of the review. Some of the things from the previous game also made its way in here. Some stuff that people really didn't like from the last game, such as rolling around a dumpster to climb up, moving ladders to climb up, moving boards to climb across gaps, all that stuff. There's even more of it in this game than there was in the last game, which is odd because somehow Naughty Dog said that they toned it down. They didn't tone it down. There's more of it in this game. Probably the fact that the game is much longer than the previous game weighs into that, but you're going to still be doing it a lot of the time. You're still going to be opening a lot of gates. You're going to come across a locked door. And in this game, the way that you get around most locked doors is you just find a window to smash out, and then for some reason you unlock the door again, even though you're never going to actually go back that way again 90% of the time. Once again, this still is a linear game. Even though you're in this huge area, once you go through a building, once you drop through a crack, once you open the door and go through it, you're probably never going to go back again. So the fact that they tried to turn part of the game into this quasi-open world, it doesn't really work because of the structure of the game and the fact that once you progress a story beat, you are locked out, and you can't even restart the encounter. You would actually have to go back to the main menu and kind of start the chapter over, or at least a major part of the chapter over. So if you accidentally go through a door, you're kind of just screwed, which is fine. That's how Naughty Dog games have always worked. But in this game in particular, because of the way they set up the world and the city of Seattle, I just never felt... There was something marked on my map at one point, and I was trying to get back, but I just couldn't get back to it. And it made you seem, because you have a map and this, hey, you have a way to travel around, it seems like you'd be able to get back to it, but you actually can't because of the structure of a Naughty Dog game. It hamstrings you. I don't know why they think that those two styles mesh together, but I don't think they do at all. It's kind of similar to Metro Exodus a little bit, where they did like a quasi-open world sequence, but that game even they did it more. It's like, okay, you're on this map now, clear it out. With this Naughty Dog game, Last of Us Part 2, you're really only doing this for a few chapters, but it makes it seem like I don't know, it's like a half open world, but at the end of the day, it's really still a linear hallway shooter at the end of the day. It's a weird combination. I don't think they necessarily pulled it off. I know the environment looks great. Everything looks great. The stores look great. Everything looks fantastic. I just don't think it's all that interesting at the end of the day when that's all you're seeing, and especially when you compare it to the variety that the last game had. Kind of dropping the ball here. There's a few interesting areas. That's about it. Some of the other stuff I wanted to give a note to is that one of the complaints that I have as someone who is a completionist of this game is that the amount of collectibles in this game is absolutely asinine. There's almost 300 different types of collectibles to get. Well, not types of collectibles, but 300 different collectibles to get of various types in this game. Now, if you're not someone who cares about that stuff, it's not going to affect you at all. But if you're someone who wants to go around and find all the notes and stuff like that, and read some of the backstory, gets filled in with stuff like that, that's overkill. It's insane overkill. Now, again, I know that only affects a small amount of players, but for me, it does affect me because I like to be a completionist with my game, and that is just a super annoyance for me. Now, I want to get into some of the different story beats of the game. I want to start talking about some of the plot and some of the basic premises that happen. Now, I know there's a huge brouhaha going on about the characters in this game. So what I want to do specifically for at least a while here is not even really discuss the characters at all. We might touch on it briefly a little bit later on, but I want to keep this focused on problems that the story itself has. The plot, the pacing, some of those type issues. I'm not going to be sitting here and having this huge rhetorical fight about with the characters with everybody. That's not the point here. I think there's some major issues with some of the writing in this story that you don't even need to discuss the characters to point out how really bad some of the writing is. Just from a fundamental, like, this is how you write a story type of standpoint, and this is how you write a good story. Now, I'm not going to sit here and try to tell you that everything that you want to happen in a game, that is what makes a good story. But there's certain things that you need to do and to think of when you're trying to write something that's supposed to be coherent. And when your characters are running around like chickens with their heads cut off, and no one in the game is making smart decisions at all, when no one's learning anything, when so many of the characters that you're trying to create end up falling so unbelievably flat, and some of these story beats that you're trying to hit just don't work at all, and the relationships you're trying to build just when there's just no chemistry whatsoever with some of the characters, and when you want to build up sympathy, you're going to have to do a better job than some of the stuff that was done in this game, and I'm going to discuss that right now. Now, there's a couple different ways I could go about this. First, I could be very vague and say stuff that's not going to give you any actual information, like, there's pacing problems. I don't think that that's going to do justice to what needs to be talked about with this game and some of the problems with the writing. So, in order to actually point out what some of my problems are, I'm going to have to get into some specifics, because otherwise it's just going to sound like I'm complaining about the writing without anything to actually back me up. But what I want to do is point out some of the ridiculous things that happen in this game, both from an opinion-based standpoint and some of the stuff that just comes from a purely fundamental writing standpoint, stuff that you shouldn't do, and stuff that is sloppily done in this game. That's what I want to discuss, because some of it is it's stupid. It's just stupid. There's really no other way to put it. Some of the writing is just completely stupid. But anyway, right off the bat, one of the issues that I had is within the first 2 minutes of the game, it takes away all of the ambiguity of the ending of the last game. If you've played the last game, you know what I'm talking about. And Joel, with his decision that he made at the Firefly Hospital, the way he handles things with Ellie afterwards, and you, the player, are left along with Ellie trying to decide how you feel about what Joel is telling you and how you feel about how he handled the situation, knowing what you know as a player. There's a lot of ambiguity. There's a lot of debate that has happened over the years about whether or not Joel is actually a hero or a villain in the first game. In this game, it strips away all ambiguity entirely, and it's just like, no, Joel is a villain, without a doubt. And not only is he a villain, he is a bloodthirsty, savage villain who is just kind of a killing machine. That's how he's presented right away at the beginning of the game, and that's how he's presented really for the most part throughout the entire story when people talk about him. And even Ellie at the very end of the game there's still scenes through flashbacks and whatnot where she still is harboring deep resentment towards Joel, and Joel is really not viewed as a good character in this game in any way, shape, or form, even during the heartwarming moments when he's supposed to be. It's just not, he's not handled that way in this game. It is no, Joel is a villain, he always was a villain, and that is what he's always going to be. There's really no argument at all, and really just shatters that ending for so many people who wanted to have that debate and that conversation, because I know a lot of people who felt that he was the hero of that story, and some people who thought that he was the villain. But no. Second game strips all that away entirely. Joel, bad guy, cue the scenes. Now what happens is, for the first hour and a half of part 2, what happens is, it is just a string of the most coincidental, most ham-fisted plot points I've ever seen. It's just like bang, plot point, bang, plot point, bang, plot point. Now, in order to really discuss this, I have to do something that Sony and Naughty Dog didn't want me to do. I have to talk about the character that you play literally half the game as, because they try to market it as though you're going to be playing as Ellie. Well, you do, for about half the game. And the other half you play as another character called Abby. Yes, I know, I said it, I know. I said the name, Abby. Now, you need to know that you're playing as two different characters with two different sets of everything. Different stories, different weapons, different skill upgrades, everything. Two entirely separate characters that you're playing in this game, and that is the viewpoint that the story is written from as well. Now, what am I talking about when I say that they just start slapping plot points together? Well, again, this is going to be spoiling stuff, but I have to discuss this so I can explain to you how unbelievably rushed this is. So, there's this introduction scene when you first meet Abby, and you find out that this is a group coming from Seattle to Jackson, Wyoming. Now, that is almost 1,000 miles on foot for all these people traveling. There's a pretty sizable contingent of people with her, and they've traveled all this way because they're on the hunt for Joel, and you find this out right away at the start of the game. Now, what coincidences am I talking about in these rushed plot points? Well, as soon as you get into town, and as soon as you get into the area, it's like, oh, look, that must be the town where they're at. Oh, and, well, we need to go try to get some information about them. We'll have to see who's around, and maybe we can interrogate them and get some information out of them. But instead of finding anyone and getting any information, the group instantly runs into Joel and Tommy. And right away, they get lured back to going into the camp with Abby, who's trying to take out Joel, and her group is there to seek revenge upon Joel. And as soon as they get into the camp, it ensues. Within 20 seconds of you entering the compound, it's all over, kids. It's all over, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And during all this, another coincidence, while this is all happening, Ellie just happens to find this exact location, and just happens to show up in time to witness everything go down, so that she can be set on her path. It's the most ridiculous sequence of coincidences I've ever seen. I don't understand who wrote that and sat there and thought, hey, this is how you present a story, and this is how you pace out the most important part of the entire story. And by the way, that is the most important part of the whole story. That's what sets everything rolling, and everything that happens after that is so sloppily written that it just doesn't even matter. After this point, after the first part of the game, the first chapter here, it's just all downhill. So, it starts out rough with the plot pacing, and then it just falls off a cliff the rest of the way. What else am I talking about here? Well, there's so many narrative holes and just absolute dissonance that you would have to have. So, for example, Ellie is on a quest for revenge against Ellie and her group. Now, why is she on a quest for revenge? You would think that if you were part of Abby's group and you traveled 1,000 miles almost to go and take out Joel, you might think that you would also take out his brother and the little girl on the floor who's sitting there saying, I'm going to kill you all, I'm going to kill you all, I'm going to kill you all. You might think that they wouldn't leave them alive, but instead they left them alive. There's really no reason. As you go throughout the rest of the game, you'll find out that the other group that Abby is with, none of the people are really redeemable in any way, shape, or form. They're all kind of just jerks anyway. They don't feel bad at all for what they did. They don't have any remorse at all for what they did to Joel. So why would they keep Joel and Ellie alive? It makes no sense. But of course, we have to have this plot point so that Ellie can go on her hero's quest, right? Right. So Ellie takes off. And she's trying to infiltrate the city with her friend Dina. And she's going off to fight an unknown group all by herself in a city that, once again, is almost 1,000 miles away from where she's going. So she treks across 4 states to get to Washington with just the clothes on her back and her friend. And what do? What's one of the first things they start doing? Of course, what you would do, especially after you just got through an area where you had to kill a bunch of clickers and other infected, what would you do? Well, if you're these two, you would start going into a music store and start banging on the drums. And Ellie's going to pick up the guitar and start playing the guitar, because that's not going to draw any attention. That's not going to draw any noise. I'm sitting there saying, like, how is this something they're including in the game? They're trying to have a little reflective character building moment, but it makes absolutely no sense at all in the context of where you're at and what's happening in the game. It's not like this is a long, drawn-out game like the first one where it spans several months worth of time, because aside from certain flashback sequences, most of the story takes place within a 3-day time span. So it's not like this long, leisurely type of story like the first game was, where everything is paced out very slowly. In this game, everything's happening right now, right now, right now. Yet multiple times throughout this game, you have to play the guitar as Ellie as part of to progress the story. And then later on, you have the option to practice when she's at sort of the home base that they acquire in the town. But it's baffling that you would be sitting there making that much noise when you're trying to hide out in a city that has thousands of enemy troops in it, and is also being attacked and infiltrated by a second faction. And oh, by the way, there's still the infected everywhere throughout the city. But let's just make a bunch of noise because that makes sense. Also, there's some other issues with the pacing of the timeline. So Ellie is in Seattle with Dina. Now, here's another spoiler. Dina finds out that she's probably pregnant, and because she has morning sickness and she's been throwing up. Now, somehow, again, in this 3-day period, she goes from, I think I might be pregnant, to she's showing visibly that she's pregnant, and oh, by the way, she's having such major complications that she's becoming deathly ill and has to get rushed back to Jackson for medical treatment. Like, what? What? In 3 days? It progresses to that point? That seems to be a little bit ridiculous. Just some extra stress thrown into the mix for there's really no cognitive reason there. But so much of this game just doesn't seem to make much sense. Let's talk about something not even related to a spoiler really of any kind, but let's talk about just the structure of how the story is. Because once you get to a certain point in the game, it seems like there's been a big climax towards the end of the game, and then you even go into what appears to be the epilogue. And it's sort of a drawn-out epilogue, but it's actually not the epilogue at all, because late in the game, what would be the equivalent of if you're watching a 3-hour movie, if in the last 5 minutes of that movie, they introduced an entirely new location, an entirely new plot line, an entirely new group of enemies, an entirely new enemy type. Just to recycle through the same story beats that you've already been through multiple times before. Just to reiterate it, as if you didn't already play through the first 24 hours of the game, as if you don't already know how this is going to play out. And they set it up in such a ridiculous way, and I gotta just come out and tell you. Because what happens throughout this entire game is Abby keeps leaving Ellie and Tommy alive like she's some sort of bad Batman villain from the old TV show with Adam West. Like she's the Joker or the Riddler, and she's just leaving them in easily escapable situations, or just leaving them alive and then acting surprised when they come back seeking revenge. And then on the flip side, you have Ellie's part of the story where she's just completely so hell-bent on killing Abby that she's going to go across the country, she's going to kill hundreds of people, and then every time, and there's multiple times, where she's given a chance to actually kill Abby, she doesn't do it. She doesn't do it. And then she'll have a flashback and be like, oh no, wait, I gotta kill her. And then she'll attack her and be like, have another flashback. Oh no, wait, I can't kill her. And it keeps happening. And it just makes no sense. And there's no big payoff at the end of the game where you're supposed... I don't know what point they thought they were making with the story, because there really is no actual point there. It's just a bunch of characters, especially the two main characters, making stupid decisions the entire time. Every time you would come up to what you thought would be a climactic moment or a pivotal moment of the game, I was sitting there like rolling my eyes like, you're just going to leave her alive? You're just going to leave her alive? You're going to leave her alive again? You're going to leave her alive again? You're going to leave her alive a third time? You're going to leave her alive a third time? Like, I thought this was a story of revenge and hate. Well, it doesn't really seem that way. It seems like it just makes it makes no sense. And at the end of the game, Ellie goes, if even further than she ever went before, to this new location, mows down 100 people just to get to Abby, and then lets her live again. I have no idea what this writing is supposed to be. She suddenly feels bad, and then she doesn't feel bad. What is this? You're trying to make a point? If so, I don't know what it is, because I don't think you were actually trying to make a point the entire game with actually having good writing. I don't think that was the point here. And I don't understand how people are saying that the writing is quote-unquote good here, because there's so many different issues just from a fundamental storytelling standpoint. You don't start an entirely new plot line at the very end of anything, of any story. You don't just be like, okay, here's a whole new faction, whole new enemy set, whole entirely different storyline. It makes no sense, especially when all you're going to do is just rehash what you've already done and hit the same overall premise and story beats. It's absolutely mind-boggling. There's more, though. There's more. I've mentioned briefly that there's flashback scenes, and there are in this game. Some of you may remember from one of the older Uncharted games, there was a specific game that had a very long and drawn-out sequence where you played as young Nathan Drake, which added a little bit of flavor to his backstory, but really most people agree dragged on far too long and didn't really justify itself being there or being as long as it was. Now, in this game, there is way more of that. There's a ton of different flashback sequences or epilogue style sequences that really don't do a whole lot to add to the pacing of the story whatsoever. And the real issue here is that there's so little actual plot progress that happens throughout the entire middle part of the game that having all these flashbacks just seems like they're trying to only differentiate the setting for a little bit, so you're not only in Seattle the entire time. So they have these flashback sequences, especially with Ellie throughout the first part of the game, and then later on with Abby, she also has her own flashback sequences, and they just don't really, they're not progressing the story, they're not giving you any information that's critical to the story either. It's just really a little flavoring in the backstory, whereas in the first game, every single scene pretty much pushed the story forward. Now, studies have shown that audiences tend to react more favorably to scenes when they're actually pushing the story forward, or at least developing the characters more. In this game, the flashbacks don't really develop anything. We already know everything we need to know about the motivations for all the characters after the first act. There's nothing else we really need to know. Yet, we keep getting hit with these flashbacks after flashbacks, and all it really does is extend the game. And the other annoying thing about it, and this ties into the gameplay a little bit, every time you go into one of these flashback scenes, they usually have some sort of combat. But it takes away all of the weapons and all of the character upgrades that you've been playing with the entire time just to put you back into this flashback, so they neuter your character every time you do it. So the game gets less enjoyable to play from a gameplay standpoint. And all they're doing is rehashing stuff that in some cases we already know, and in some cases, at the end of the day, doesn't really hit home. There's one particular character that I'm thinking of when it comes to Abby's group that they really tried to turn into something. A character named Owen. He's one of the most bland and boring characters I've ever seen. Just a complete blank piece of paper with nothing going on. He's a pushover. He gets pushed around by everybody. He's not interesting in any way, shape, or form. Yet this is the main character that we're supposed to care about when it comes to Abby. And then the rest of her crew is just a bunch of very unlikable characters. Everyone she runs with. Mel is not pleasant in any scene she's in. The guy Danny is just a gigantic jerk in every scene he's in. He's completely unlikable. Nora, she tries to redeem herself at the end of the game with one scene that they show, but based on what we saw in the first half of the game from her, she's completely unlikable. Why would I want to even pay attention to what she has to say? The Manny character, a super obnoxious guy who just brags about himself non-stop the entire time. There's no one in this group that I would care about at all. Henceforth, I didn't feel any sympathy for any of them. I didn't feel any shock value when Ellie took them out. And yes, that's what happens. But I didn't feel any sympathy at all. I didn't feel bad for Abby because I hated those people. They weren't likable. I also didn't feel bad in the prologue for her story when we see what happens when Joel storms the Firefly compound, because if you don't know, once again, here's another spoiler, Abby's father is the doctor that Joel kills at the end of the last game. That's what propels her revenge story. But the actor that they got is a guy who you may recognize from Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul. It's a guy, he's a character actor who just always plays kind of a douche. And he's not a likable guy. And that's who they chose to be the actor for Abby's father. And in the scenes where they show him, he's actively begging with Marlene to kill Ellie. So again, I don't feel bad at all when Joel does what he does. And I don't feel necessarily bad for Abby that these things are happening to her. Because none of these people are likable. I'm not sympathetic towards any of them. They're bad characters. Now notice, I'm not going off about anything political. I know it's crazy. They're just poorly written characters. To a person. All of them are. And that just goes across the board. Now, when it comes to Ellie is not very likable in this game either. I didn't really care all that much about Ellie by the end of things. She's sour towards pretty much everyone. She chases away everyone that's her friend in the entire game, or, they meet unfortunate ends. Something else I got to point out. Tommy, for some reason, is somehow unkillable in this game. There's 2 separate scenes where it looks like he's dead. And then he just comes back to life mysteriously. And then at one point, another spoiler, at one point, he gets shot directly in the eye. Yet he comes back with nothing, just like, oh, here's Tommy again. Like, what? Huh? What? Multiple times I thought he was dead. And he's not dead. And by the end of the game, he's actually still alive. Now, there's so much more I could go on to. This is already a 40-minute review. This is my longest review I've ever done. There's so much ham-fisted nonsense when it comes to the writing in this game. There's so much bad writing and unbelievable decisions that it's the equivalent of if you're watching a horror movie and if Ellie is the main character, she just keeps running up the stairs every time. Why are you running up the stairs? She just keeps doing it, like on a loop. Like, what am I watching? She just keeps making the same mistake. And Abby keeps making the same mistake. Now, there's really, I don't know what else I can even say about how bad I think most of the writing is and how bad the plot is handled. And you can sit there and you can, if you want to get all critical and say, oh, you went into this biased against it. Well, I gave it a fair shot. I tried this game out. I played the entire game. I've beaten it. And in fact, depending on how annoying it is to go back and get the collectibles, I might even get the platinum trophy before saying that I'm done with it. The gameplay, I liked. It actually made me wish that they included the multiplayer that they were supposed to include instead of ripping it out and presumably going to charge us for it later. The gameplay I did like. The stealth, I had a few issues with. I don't like the inclusion of the dogs and stuff like that. I think that was more of an annoyance than anything else, but it was fine. The graphics obviously look great. The sound, the music, all of that is great. The voice acting is even great. The dialogue is mostly pretty good, but it's the story that's awful, and it's the fact that there's no variety in the setting. These are the issues that I had. It just got drab. There was no suspense to the storyline. There was no suspense to the areas. The areas in the last game were done so much better. They were so much more memorable. The set pieces were more memorable. The side characters were much more likable. I talked about this in one of my previous videos. Contrast Abby's group of Nora, Owen, Mel, Manny, Danny, and her father. Compare that group to the characters from the first game, like Bill and Tess and Henry and Sam and all the other characters from that game. It's just a more likable, more relatable group. A group that I cared about. And when stuff bad happened to them in that game, it did hit me emotionally. In this game, I couldn't care less about any of these characters. And that's a fault of the writing. The fact that the story is so long and so bloated as well does not do anything for it. Very similar to how I felt about Uncharted 4, this game does not justify its length. It doesn't justify its runtime. And you might say, well, that's a stupid argument to make. I mean, obviously, why wouldn't you want the game to be longer, more gameplay? Well, yeah, that's a fair enough argument. But the problem is, it needs to justify its length. And this game doesn't do it, just like Uncharted 4 didn't justify its length. It takes too long between story beats for no reason. There's too much gameplay where all you're doing is scavenging and not getting anywhere. You're not progressing the story. At the end of the day, this still is a story-based franchise and a developer that does narrative-based games. This is still a narrative-based game first and foremost. Tons of cutscenes. Hours and hours and hours of cutscenes. This is a story-based theatrical, cinematic type of game. And for it to drop the ball so badly in some of these areas, that's my problem with the game. I'm not going to sit here and enjoy it. Playing through it, skipping the cutscenes, probably have a much better time because some of the combat scenarios are really cool, and you can actually go back and do the encounters again via a sub menu after you clear them out. So that is something that is interesting that you can go back and do. I think those are the best sequences in the game. The graphics look great. All this, from a technical standpoint, it's hard to complain about the game. But the story and the writing and the unlikable characters just drag down the experience. Totally. I don't like this game as much as the first one. And I am a huge fan. Actually, and before you say you're just a Naughty Dog hater or you're an Xbot, I'm primarily a PlayStation player when it comes to consoles, for sure, over Xbox. Now, I own both systems. And when it comes to Naughty Dog in particular, you can't sit there and tell me I'm a Naughty Dog hater. I have platinumed every Uncharted game. I have platinumed the first Last of Us game twice, both on the PS3 and the PS4. I've played their multiplayer extensively. I played the Last of Us multiplayer well over 2,000 matches. Uncharted 4 multiplayer, I'm actually ranked top 1% worldwide in the team deathmatch. So, like, I've played these games a lot. It's not that I have a deep-seated anti-Naughty Dog history. I don't. I have problems with this game. From a technical standpoint and a gameplay standpoint, I don't have really that many issues with. From a setting standpoint, from a pacing standpoint, everything else, storyline, definitely I have issues. Anyway, that's it for me, Coach Toolshed. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Please subscribe. If you want to stay in tune with the channel, head forward, and as always, keep it turned to 11.